At first glance, the morning looked perfect. The sun rose gently over Miami, painting the sky in soft orange and pale pink, as if nothing in the world was out of place. Palm trees barely moved, the ocean breathed slowly, and the city woke up pretending it had slept peacefully. But had it really? The heat arrived early, long before noon. It clung to skin, to clothes, to the quiet streets, as if Miami itself didn't want to let go of anyone who stepped outside. By 7:12 a.m., sweat was already forming on foreheads at bus stops, inside corner diners, and along sidewalks where people walked with practiced patience. But what exactly were they preparing themselves for? Cars rolled down Biscayne Boulevard, engines humming low, radios murmuring yesterday's news. Gas was expensive, tempers were short, and nobody talked about it out loud. A man in a faded short-sleeved shirt folded his newspaper twice, not because he needed to, but because his hands needed something to do. Why did so many mornings begin with the same nervous silence? Inside small Cuban cafes, coffee machines hissed like tired animals. The smell of strong espresso mixed with salt from the ocean and exhaust from passing cars. People stood close, not speaking much, listening instead to the clink of cups, to the scrape of chairs, to the unspoken understanding that life felt heavier than it used to. When did routine become another word for endurance? Children waited for school buses under the shade of palms, their backpacks already damp from the humidity. Their parents watched from doorways, cigarette smoke drifting upward, eyes distant. These were not dramatic goodbyes. They were quiet, automatic, practiced over years of economic pressure, migration, and uncertain futures. How much worry can be hidden behind a casual wave? Miami sold itself as paradise, even in the 1970s. Postcards showed beaches, smiles, endless sunshine. But behind the brightness, the city carried fatigue, financial strain, overcrowded neighborhoods, rising crime, and the lingering aftertaste of a country still recovering. From Vietnam and Watergate, if everything looked fine, why did it feel like everyone was holding their breath? By mid-morning, office buildings cooled their interiors with artificial air, creating a sharp contrast to the sticky streets outside. Typewriters clicked, phones rang, paper shuffled endlessly. People worked not toward dreams, but toward stability, toward survival disguised as productivity. When did ambition quietly turn into maintenance? Down near the water, fishermen prepared their boats, hands rough, movements slow and precise. They knew the tides, the weather, the unspoken rules of the sea. The ocean had moods just like the city. Some days it gave generously, other days it took without warning. Was Miami any different? This was a normal morning. No sirens, no headlines, no visible crisis. And yet, beneath the sunlight and routine, something felt unresolved, like a question no one dared to ask out loud. Because if this was just another ordinary day in 1970s Miami, why did it already feel like something was about to change? By late morning, Miami felt heavier. The sun no longer painted the city, it pressed down on it, flattening shadows and patience alike. Sidewalks shimmered, and the air seemed too thick to breathe properly, as if time itself had decided to slow down and watch what people would do under pressure. But how long could anyone move forward without relief? Lunch hours arrived without appetite. In diners and corner cafes, ceiling fans rotated endlessly, pushing warm air from one table to another. Ice clinked in half-empty glasses, melting faster than it could cool. Conversations stayed short, careful, unfinished. Why did even simple words feel exhausting in this heat? Office workers stepped outside, loosening ties, rolling sleeves, blinking against the brightness. They leaned against buildings, not to rest, but to feel grounded. Newsstands displayed headlines about inflation, crime, and distant political debates that felt uncomfortably close. If the country was changing, why did it feel like ordinary people were the ones absorbing the impact? In Little Havana, midday meant movement. Grocers restocked shelves, delivery trucks blocked narrow streets, radios played Spanish ballads that spoke of home and loss. The smell of frying oil, ripe fruit, and hot asphalt filled the air. Many here had already left one life behind. How much uncertainty could a person carry before it became routine? Buses ran late. They always did. People waited anyway, standing shoulder to shoulder, sweat marking shirts in uneven patterns. Nobody complained. Complaining required energy, and energy was in short supply. When did patience become a survival skill rather than a virtue? At the beach, tourists still arrived, unaware or unconcerned. Towels unfolded. Sunscreen was applied. Laughter cut through the sound of waves. But even here, locals noticed the difference. The crowds felt larger. The money thinner, the future less certain. Could paradise feel temporary without anyone admitting it? Back in residential neighborhoods, televisions flickered quietly in living rooms. Afternoon talk shows filled the silence, their cheerful tones clashing with the mood of the houses they occupied. Elderly residents dozed in armchairs, windows open, listening for familiar sounds, cars, footsteps, voices to reassure themselves that life outside was still moving. What happens when reassurance depends on noise? The heat reached its peak. Asphalt softened. Tempers tightened. The city paused, not in peace but in endurance. Everyone waited for something, relief, evening, change, without knowing what it would look like when it arrived. Because midday in 1970s, Miami was not about action. It was about persistence. And as the sun stood directly overhead, burning away illusions, one question lingered in the thick air. If this was how the city survived its days, what would it reveal when night finally came? By mid-afternoon, Miami softened, but not in relief. The light turned pale, almost tired, as if the sun itself had begun to lose interest in watching. Shadows stretched just enough to offer false comfort, and the streets settled into a low, humming silence. The city hadn't relaxed. It had simply learned how to wait, but for what? Shops remained open, though fewer customers wandered inside. Clerks leaned against counters, counting minutes instead of money. Cash registers rang less often now, each sound sharper in the quiet. Business was still happening, but without urgency, without belief. When did effort stop promising reward? In residential blocks, windows stayed open, curtains moving slowly with the breeze that barely reached indoors. The smell of detergent, old furniture, and lingering cigarette smoke blended into something familiar, something unremarkable. This was the smell of continuity, of lives repeating themselves day after day. How long can repetition feel safe before it becomes a trap? School buses returned children home, releasing them into streets where parents were not yet finished with work. They played without direction, stickball in alleys, voices echoing between buildings, laughter breaking through the quiet. For a moment, the city sounded young again, but even their joy felt borrowed. How early does a city teach its children to grow up? In small offices and government buildings, paperwork continued without enthusiasm. Desks were cleared slowly. Chairs scraped back with reluctance. People glanced at clocks more often now, as if time might respond to attention. The workday was ending, but the weight of the day was not. What exactly were people hoping to leave behind? Traffic thickened as the afternoon faded. Cars moved in waves, inching forward, stopping, starting again. Windows were rolled down, not for comfort, but necessity. Drivers stared ahead, faces expressionless, radios filling the space with music that promised escape but delivered only background noise. When did movement stop feeling like progress? In apartment buildings near the coast, doors opened and closed quietly. Groceries were carried inside, shoes were removed, fans were switched on. These were small rituals, performed without thought, practiced until they became invisible. Yet every ritual suggested preparation for rest, for evening, for something unseen. What were people bracing themselves for? Miami in the 1970s did not announce its turning points. It allowed them to arrive unnoticed. As the sky shifted from bright blue to muted gold, the city held its breath again, just as it had that morning and the morning before, because afternoon was never the end of anything. It was only the pause before the city showed its other face. Evening didn't fall over Miami. It slid in quietly, almost politely, as if the city preferred not to draw attention to the moment everything shifted. The heat loosened its grip just enough to give the illusion of relief, and people stepped outside again, breathing deeper, but breathing did not mean relaxing, did it? Storefront lights flickered on one by one. Neon signs buzzed softly, painting sidewalks in pinks, blues, and tired reds. These colors promised comfort, distraction, normalcy. But promises in Miami had a habit of feeling temporary. Why did the city feel more awake at night than it ever did during the day? In homes across the city, televisions took their place as evening companions. Dinner plates were balanced on knees. Forks paused midair as news anchors spoke of inflation, crime statistics, distant wars, and political fallout. No one argued with the screen. No one trusted it either. When did information stop feeling like reassurance? The smell of food drifted through open windows. Fried plantains, overcooked meat, cheap takeout, rice and beans prepared from habit rather than desire. Families ate together, but not always in conversation. Silence filled the spaces between bites, interrupted only by the hum of appliances and the distant sound of traffic. What does togetherness mean when everyone is tired? Bars began to fill. Not loudly, not yet. Men and women sat on stools, drinks sweating in their hands, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Laughter arrived in short bursts, too sharp, too quick, as if it needed to be justified. Alcohol wasn't celebration here. It was permission to forget, to speak, to sit still. What happens when forgetting becomes part of the routine? On the streets, the mood shifted. Police cruisers rolled slowly past intersections, lights off, but presence undeniable. Groups gathered under street lamps, voices low, movements cautious. Miami at night required awareness. The rules were unwritten, but everyone seemed to know them. How did a city teach caution without ever saying the word? The ocean reflected the last light of day, darkening into something unreadable. Waves sounded closer now, louder, as if the sea wanted to remind the city of its own power. Boats moved silently in the distance, their purposes unknown, their destinations unspoken. What traveled through these waters after sunset? This was still an ordinary evening. No alarms, no breaking news, no visible chaos. Yet the city felt alert, listening, watching, waiting. Because when night settled fully over 1970s Miami, the question was never if something would happen, but who would notice when it did. Night didn't bring rest to Miami. It brought distance. The kind that settled between people, between buildings, between what was seen and what was understood. Streetlights cast long, uneven shadows, stretching across sidewalks like unanswered questions. The city was quieter now, but was it ever truly asleep? Windows glowed softly in apartment buildings. Some stayed dark, intentionally so. Curtains were drawn, doors were locked twice. Inside fans hummed steadily, masking smaller sounds people preferred not to identify. Safety in 1970s Miami was less about trust and more about routine. When did caution become instinct? In neighborhoods closer to downtown, footsteps echoed louder than they should have. A single car passing too slowly could draw glances from behind curtains. People measured their movements carefully now, where to stand, how long to linger, when to leave. No one explained these habits. They were absorbed, learned over time. How does fear teach without ever introducing itself? Bars grew louder, then suddenly quieter. The shift was subtle, but familiar. Voices dropped. Laughter thinned out. Glasses were emptied faster. Some people left early, sensing something they couldn't name. Others stayed, needing the noise to drown out the day. What did it say about a city when silence felt more dangerous than sound? Along the shoreline, the ocean darkened completely. The wind carried salt and damp air, cooling skin but sharpening awareness. Boats moved with lights low or off entirely, slipping across the water unnoticed. To outsiders, it was just the sea at night. To locals, it was something more layered, more complicated. What stories moved through Miami after dark? Police radios crackled briefly, then fell silent again. Patrols passed through neighborhoods, not to intervene, but to remind. Presence mattered even when action did not. The balance was fragile, understood but rarely questioned. How long can order exist without confidence? Inside homes, people prepared for sleep. Shoes were placed by doors. Keys were set in the same spot every night. Televisions clicked off, leaving behind a ringing quiet. These small rituals were comforting because they were predictable. Predictability, in a city like this, felt close to control. What happens when control is only an illusion? Miami held itself carefully at night. Not tense, but aware. And as midnight approached, the city seemed to lean inward, listening to its own heartbeat. Because night was not the end of the day. It was the moment when the city decided what it would remember, and what it would bury by morning. Somewhere after midnight, Miami changed again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a thought that refused to leave. The streets emptied further, yet the city did not feel lighter. It felt exposed, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what was real. But was reality ever comfortable? The air cooled slightly, enough to be noticed, but not enough to soothe. Humidity still pressed against skin, clinging to everything it touched. Streetlights flickered, their glow uneven, creating pockets of darkness that felt intentional. In those gaps, the city seemed to hide parts of itself it had no interest in explaining. What truths only appeared when no one was watching. In apartment buildings, sleep came in fragments. Radios murmured quietly beside beds. Fans rattled in tired protest. People shifted in their sleep, waking without knowing why. Hearts briefly racing before settling again. Even rest felt alert. How does a city teach its residents to sleep with one eye open? A late-night bus rolled through nearly empty streets, its interior lights harsh against the darkness. A handful of passengers stared forward, each carrying reasons that didn't need sharing. Night jobs, missed connections. Lives that moved just out of sync with the rest of the city. What kind of future waits for people who live between hours? Near the water, the tide shifted. Waves reached farther onto the sand, erasing footprints left earlier in the evening. The ocean worked quietly, patiently, removing evidence of the day before. Miami had learned that lesson well, how to erase without confrontation. What stories disappeared before anyone thought to ask? In distant neighborhoods, a door slammed. Somewhere else, a voice rose briefly, then fell silent. These sounds did not trigger panic. They were simply noted, filed away, absorbed into the background of the night. Familiarity dulled reaction. When does adaptation become acceptance? And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sky began to change. Not with light, but with possibility. A faint gray crept in at the edges of the horizon, hinting at another morning. Another cycle. Another ordinary day waiting to begin. The city did not celebrate this moment. It endured it. What does it mean to keep going without expecting improvement? Because when dawn returned to 1970s Miami, it did not arrive with answers. It arrived with repetition. And somewhere in the quiet before morning, the city carried a final unanswered question into the light. If every day felt the same, how much of the past was being lost without anyone noticing? Morning returned without ceremony. No announcement. No acknowledgement of what the night had taken, or what it had spared. The sky lightened gradually, as if Miami preferred subtlety when beginning again. Birds called from palm trees, traffic resumed its low murmur, and the city slipped back into motion. But had anything truly reset? Shops reopened. Cafes unlocked their doors. Coffee brewed strong enough to mask fatigue but not memory. People stepped outside, carrying the same faces they had worn the day before, practiced and composed. The rhythm felt familiar, reassuring even. But familiarity had a cost. How many mornings does it take before yesterday stops mattering? Newspapers landed on doorsteps, folded neatly, headlines chosen carefully. Some stories were emphasized. Others quietly disappeared. Life in Miami moved forward selectively, preserving what was useful and letting the rest fade. Who decided which truths deserved to survive another day? The heat returned early, right on schedule. It wrapped itself around the city like a reminder. Nothing had changed. Sidewalks warmed. Shirts darkened with sweat. People waited at bus stops again, eyes forward, thoughts private. The routine had reasserted itself. Was routine a form of stability or avoidance? Children prepared for school. Repeating motions learned through observation rather than instruction. Parents watched, not with fear but with quiet calculation. Each goodbye carried unspoken hope that today would pass without incident. When did survival become the standard for success? Miami in the 1970s did not define itself by moments of crisis. It defined itself by continuity. Days followed nights. Nights followed days. The city learned how to function inside uncertainty, turning adaptation into identity. There was comfort in that, but also loss. What disappears when endurance replaces expectation? From the outside, it was easy to miss. The sunshine, the ocean, the movement. Everything suggested ease. But those who lived inside the cycle understood the truth. Ordinary days carried weight, and that weight accumulated quietly. Because in a city that learned how to move on without reflection, the most dangerous thing was not change. It was forgetting that anything had ever been different. As the morning settled in fully, Miami resumed its pace with remarkable precision. Not hurried, not slow, simply practiced. The kind of movement that comes from years of repetition, from knowing exactly how much effort to give and no more. People navigated the city with quiet efficiency. But what happens to a place when nothing surprises it anymore? Workdays unfolded again in offices, shops, kitchens, and docks. Conversations stayed polite, shallow, and safe. No one asked how anyone was really doing. The answers would have taken too long, required too much honesty. Silence, once again, was faster. When did speed become more valuable than truth? At street corners, familiar faces appeared at familiar times. The man who sold fruit from a wooden cart. The woman who swept the same storefront every morning. The bus driver who nodded but never spoke. These were not landmarks, but they anchored the city just the same. What happens when people become part of the scenery? Miami sounds returned in layers. The low grind of traffic, the distant call of radios, the rhythmic slap of waves against concrete. None of it demanded attention. It blended into a background hum that allowed life to continue uninterrupted. Comforting, yes, but numbing too. How much awareness can be lost before it's noticed? In homes, the evidence of yesterday had already been erased. Dishes washed, clothes folded, beds made tight. The city was good at tidying itself, at smoothing over rough edges. Disorder was temporary. Appearance was permanent. What gets sacrificed to maintain the illusion of order? The sun climbed higher, bleaching colors, flattening contrasts. Miami looked clean in daylight, almost innocent. The night felt distant now, unreal. Whatever had lingered in the dark had been pushed aside by routine. Was that resilience or denial? Because ordinary time had a way of absorbing everything. Joy, fear, memory. And as another unremarkable day stretched ahead, Miami carried forward not because it believed things would improve, but because stopping was never an option. The city didn't ask where it was going. It only asked how to keep moving. And somewhere beneath the rhythm of daily life, a quiet tension remained unresolved, unnamed, waiting patiently for a moment when routine would no longer be enough. By late morning, Miami had fully reclaimed its confidence. The streets filled in. Conversations grew louder. Laughter returned in measured doses. To an outsider, the city looked alive, functional, even optimistic. But appearances in Miami had always been carefully managed. How much truth could a place hide behind momentum? Markets buzzed with activity. Prices were discussed quietly, sometimes with a shake of the head, sometimes with resignation. Inflation was no longer shocking. It was expected. People adjusted without protest, recalibrating their lives in small, almost invisible ways. One less item, one more shift, one more compromise. At what point do compromises begin to redefine who people are? In offices, calendars were checked, deadlines acknowledged, ambitions trimmed. Dreams still existed, but they had been resized to fit reality. No one spoke of escape anymore, not seriously. Miami was not something to leave. It was something to manage. When did survival replace aspiration as the measure of success? Along residential streets, neighbors passed each other with polite familiarity. They knew names, faces, routines, but rarely stories. Privacy was respected because exposure felt risky. Everyone carried something they preferred not to explain. How close can people live without truly knowing one another? The city's history pressed, quietly against the present: migration, economic swings, political tension. None of it dominated the day. Yet all of it shaped how people moved through space, how they spoke, how they trusted or didn't. Miami had learned to live layered, carrying multiple realities at once. What happens when a city never fully resolves its past? Near the water, construction crews worked steadily, building toward a future that felt more symbolic than certain. New structures rose beside older ones, each promising renewal without addressing what already existed. Progress looked impressive from a distance. Up close, it felt cautious. How many times can a city reinvent itself before it forgets why? As afternoon approached again, the cycle became undeniable. Morning confidence would give way to midday endurance. Endurance would fade into evening awareness. Awareness would dissolve into night's quiet calculations. Miami was not stuck, but it was contained. Contained by habit. Contained by necessity. Contained by a belief that tomorrow would look enough like today to be manageable. And beneath that belief, something continued to wait, patient, unresolved, and unseen. Because cities, like people, can ignore their deeper questions for only so long before ordinary days begin to carry extraordinary weight. Afternoon returned, almost on cue. Not as an event, not as a shift, just as a continuation. Miami moved forward with the quiet determination of a place that had learned not to expect surprises. Heat settled back in. Shadows shortened. The rhythm held. But what happens when consistency becomes the most defining feature of a life? In shops and offices, hours were marked by clocks rather than moments. People checked the time not because they were eager to leave, but because it reminded them that progress, however slow, was still happening. Time at least was moving. Was movement alone enough to justify endurance? Street life blurred together. Footsteps passed without recognition. Faces repeated themselves, familiar but nameless. The city functioned through this anonymity, relying on distance to maintain balance. Intimacy would have complicated things. When did detachment become a form of protection? Lunch breaks happened again, quieter than the day before. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes standing, sometimes alone. Eating was fuel, not pleasure. The future felt too uncertain to linger. How often must joy be postponed before it stops asking to return? The radio played songs that spoke of escape, freedom, better days. People listened without comment, letting the melodies pass through them like background weather. Music still mattered, but it no longer promised change. Was nostalgia already forming even then? In shaded doorways, people paused briefly, resting, watching, thinking. No one stayed long. Stillness felt risky. Miami rewarded motion, even when motion led nowhere new. What does a city fear when it cannot afford to stop? The afternoon stretched without tension, without release. Nothing broke the pattern. No headlines demanded attention. No sound disrupted the flow. And yet beneath the calm a quiet unease persisted, because the most unsettling days were never the dramatic ones. They were the days that passed without leaving a mark. And as the sun began its slow descent once more, Miami carried forward an unspoken understanding. If today felt identical to yesterday, then tomorrow might do the same. And somewhere within that repetition, something essential was slowly slipping away, unnoticed, unrecorded, and unanswered. By early evening, something felt overdue. Not wrong, just unfinished. Miami moved through the hours with the same precision it always had, yet an unspoken expectation lingered in the air, as if the city itself was waiting for a moment that would justify the weight it carried. But what happens when a breaking point never arrives? The sun lowered, softening the edges of buildings and streets. Light became forgiving, almost kind. People noticed it without commenting, as though acknowledging beauty too openly might invite disappointment. The day had been ordinary, painfully so. Wasn't something supposed to happen by now? Conversations hinted at anticipation without naming it. A pause before speaking. A glance that lingered too long. Miami felt prepared for disruption, yet none came. No sirens cut through the air. No headlines shattered the calm. The city held its breath and kept holding it. How long can anticipation exist without release? Routine continued out of habit rather than confidence. Shops closed at their usual times. Buses ran their routes. Families prepared dinner, ate, and cleaned up. Everything functioned. Everything worked. And that somehow felt unsettling. When does stability begin to resemble stagnation? There were moments, small, fleeting, when change seemed possible. A raised voice that stopped short. A crowd that formed and then dispersed. A police cruiser that slowed, then moved on. Each time, tension rose briefly, then dissolved. Miami learned again how to absorb its own potential energy. Was that control or suppression? The city had lived through visible crises before. It knew how to respond to chaos. What it struggled with was waiting. Waiting without cause. Waiting without explanation. The kind of waiting that turns inward. What happens to a place when it prepares endlessly for something that never arrives? As night approached once more, the realization settled quietly. There would be no dramatic turning point today. No moment to mark. No lesson to summarize. Just another day added to the record. And in that realization, Miami revealed something deeper than conflict, something more enduring. The city did not break because it could not afford to. It carried the tension forward instead, storing it carefully beneath routine and repetition. Because the most powerful breaking points are not the ones that happen. They are the ones that are postponed. And as darkness fell again, one final question remained unresolved. How long can a city delay change before change arrives on its own terms? Night returned, and with it, familiarity. Not comfort, familiarity. The kind that settles in quietly, convincing people that endurance is the same as safety. Miami moved through the darkness the way it always had, practiced and aware, carrying forward everything the day had not resolved. But what does a city become when it learns to live without closure? The streets reflected neon light and memory in equal measure. What had happened today blended seamlessly with what had happened yesterday and the day before that. Individual moments lost their edges, merging into something broader, heavier. This was not a single story. It was accumulation. How much weight can ordinary time hold before it reshapes identity? Homes closed in for the night, doors locked, windows darkened. Inside, people prepared to rest, not because they felt finished, but because morning would come regardless. Sleep was not an ending here. It was an intermission. When rest exists only to support repetition, what purpose does it serve? Miami carried its contradictions forward with quiet efficiency. Sunshine and anxiety, opportunity and restraint, beauty and vigilance. These opposing forces did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, shaping a city that learned how to function inside tension rather than resolve it. Was this resilience, or was it something more fragile? The ocean continued its work in the background, erasing and returning in equal measure. Waves marked time differently than clocks or calendars ever could. To the sea there was no urgency, only cycles. Miami understood that language well, perhaps too well. What gets lost when cycles replace change? And somewhere between one ordinary day and the next, the city left behind something intangible yet permanent, a way of moving through life without expecting resolution. A survival skill passed quietly from generation to generation. Useful, necessary, costly. Because the legacy of 1970s, Miami was not found in headlines or defining events. It lived in the habits people carried forward, the caution, the patience, the endurance, and as the city prepared to wake once more, repeating itself with remarkable consistency. One final thought lingered, unspoken, unresolved. If a place can survive by never stopping, does it ever truly arrive anywhere at all?